I'm Josh Smith. I've lived in Maine a lot. I'm not a native Mainer, and I've been to school all over the world. And right now, I am a professor of maritime history at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy down in Kings Point, New York. And I'm director of the American Merchant Marine Museum. And I've got a lovely office with a view over the Sound that looks right at Manhattan. So I've come a long way, I guess. But I love the history of Maine, and I've made a career out of writing books about places like Eastport and smuggling, or Castine and the War of 1812. And I really find these little communities really fascinating, and every bit as complex as the things that are going over on the magic island of Manhattan. Um, so for me, this has been a great life, and very privileged to come and talk to your community as well. Can everybody give me a big thumbs up? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, all right. Good. I wasn't sure. Okay, so I'm going to share a slideshow, I think. Okay. And there's a book I wrote about Maine and the War of 1812. It only took me 30 years, as my friends used to say. Josh, what's your rush? And there's a picture of me a couple days ago. I seem to have shed my beard in the intervening period. I hope that isn't confusing. Um, so uh, let's get into it. Let's see. Okay, so Maine's War of 1812 isn't really very well understood. A lot of it's very maritime. So it's about things you've probably heard of, like free trade and sailors' rights. That the British Navy was interfering with our shipping, and we're upset about that. And of course, stealing our sailors and making them serve in the Royal Navy. And this is a war that is hugely unpopular in New England. But I think for our purposes here tonight, it's really important because it does lead to Maine statehood. And that is not a happy process. Maine is born out of misery, I'm afraid to say. And we'll get into that in a second. So why is Maine unhappy? Well, in point of fact, it's not so different from the year 2025. There's extreme political partisanship, a lot of angry words. People can't stand to see certain leaders. The press, meaning newspapers, extremely politicized, and doing all the shenanigans that you see by MSNBC on one end or Fox News on the other. There's also a lot of economic distress where people are having a hard time making a living, and they want to know what the government's going to do about that. And that's always a peril fraught conversation. There's also a lot of religious problems. And then you pile on top of that this very unpopular war with Britain. And yeah, people really are not very happy. Um, so recently, I've been connecting this to today's events, and I actually wrote this a couple years ago, but I think it's still true that today Americans obsess about disorder in the nation. Politics have become bitterly partisan, and the news media blatantly take side. Urban elites and their rural counterparts vie for moral ascendancy. There are widespread concerns about riots, coups, and what roles the state and federal governments have in maintaining order or quelling dissent. Boy, I wrote this almost 3 years ago, still true to this day. Some alarmists even predict the end of American democracy. My message to the reader is, fear not. This republic has witnessed all those travails before and has not only survived, but generally thrived. And my evidence lies in a detailed analysis of Maine's search for a new identity separate from Massachusetts from about 1805 to 1820. And I think outside of this room and a few other places, the choice of Maine might surprise many who know it is the land of quaint villages, moxie, a personal favorite of mine, lobster rolls, and LL Bean, a political and economic backwater tucked in an obscure corner of the nation. But Maine in the early 1800s was a dynamic place, well placed for international trade with the British Empire, with a rapidly growing population. Increasingly, its citizens sought independence from Massachusetts, ultimately becoming a separate state in 1820. Why did Mainers seek separation from a large, prosperous, and important state like Massachusetts? In part because its leading citizens decided that the time was ripe for them to take control. Another factor was a growing perception that Massachusetts treated Maine as a colony to be commercially exploited and its inhabitants disdained as uncouth rustics. So these things remain true today. There was a lot of problems before the War of 1812, and I would point out that many of you are probably aware that the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, shot and killed a former Secretary of the Treasury in a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey. That's really bad, right? And I haven't seen that happen yet. J.D. Vance hasn't threatened to shoot anybody as far as I know, and let's hope he doesn't, because that would just be rude, right? Okay, so I think part of the problem here, and we're talking a lot about southern Maine or eastern Maine. I have tailored this a little bit to get up into your corner of Maine as well, but certainly in the English-speaking parts of Maine, Massachusetts tries to impose its cultural values. Some would say they still are in places like Portland, and that there is this idea of the standing order, and that's a combination of Harvard-trained clergy, these are all Congregationalists, meeting houses such as the one pictured here, that's in Alna. And a meeting house is interesting because it is a church and a town hall all mixed together. And that might trouble some of you because you're probably thinking, well, what about separation of church and state? Well, Massachusetts actually had an official Protestant religion. It was Congregationalism. And so it combined the political and the religious, and that was fine. The Constitution, actually, the Bill of Rights, calls for a separation of church and state. That's actually only the federal government. There were several states, Virginia, Rhode Island, Connecticut, that had official state religions supported, and this is a little weird, by tax money. And if you didn't belong to, say, the Congregational Church, well, you still had to pay taxes to support it. And that did not sit well with a lot of people. And this all comes back to the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which set up this idea of the standing order. And of course, where this all got regulated out of was the shire towns, right? The county seats, whatever you want to call it, wherever the courthouse was. And to impose this very orderly, but very expensive in tax terms, system of running a society. The problem is that the Massachusetts ideal runs into the Maine reality, which is it's poor, it's newly settled, the level of education is quite low, it is isolated. These settlers do not believe in a social hierarchy, that they are very egalitarian. We are all equals. And this doesn't sit so well with the people in Boston who think that people in Maine should do what they say because they are socially superior, shall we say. And then, as the icing on the cake, many of these settlers are evangelicals. They do not become Congregationalists. And evangelicals are a pretty rowdy crew. They don't have college-trained ministers. They tend not to write down sermons. It's all from the heart. There might be people rolling around on the ground or speaking in tongues or doing other things that really appalled people from Boston, essentially. So Mainers already see themselves as different. Yet here's Massachusetts trying to impose this social order on them. And while you all may or may not wear Red Sox caps in Fort Kent, that wouldn't surprise me at all if you had mixed feelings about Massachusetts and the people who sometimes come to Maine. Okay, so the religious issues are complicated. And one of the interesting issues is that Massachusetts is deeply anti-Catholic. And which is funny because today Massachusetts is very Catholic. But then Maine was actually the most Catholic part of the unified Commonwealth of Massachusetts, both meaning the District of Maine and Massachusetts. Maine actually had 3 Catholic churches in the English-speaking part of Maine. I'm not quite sure about Aroostook County. I'm pretty sure there was a church in Madawaska. But that's really taken care of by French-speaking priests from Quebec, right? So it's a different deal. And what this means is Catholic priests in Massachusetts are not allowed to marry couples as late as 1807. There's a court case about this. And so you have a very few Catholics floating in the sea of Protestants who are numerous, and there are lots of them, and they have different groups. Congregationalists were the favored group, but again, there are these evangelicals. And the Congregationalists tended to want to stay part of Massachusetts, whereas the evangelicals and the Catholics tended to want Maine to become a separate state. This is St. Patrick's, just down the street from the high school I went to, Lincoln Academy in Newcastle, Maine. And that is, I believe, the oldest surviving Catholic church, the structure in the state. Okay. So it's an unhappy place. It's a rowdy place, too. There are lots of riots, tumults, smuggling. And a lot of this is fiercely political. You've got one group called the Federalists, who sort of represent the fancy Boston people. And then ordinary farmers tend to be what are called Jeffersonians, or sometimes called Republicans. And I'll give you an example of how nasty the feelings are between these people. In North Yarmouth in 1805, I want to say, there is a local Jeffersonian who owns a boat. He's also the postmaster. And before an election night, local Federalists go down to the sloop and they paint these words all over it: Black Sal and Jefferson. Sal is, of course, Sally Hemings, Jefferson's enslaved mistress. And this is a huge insult even back then. Everybody knew about Sally Hemings. And then they cut the ropes to the sloop so that it drifted off in the tide. So, and people get beaten up, and it's really pretty tough. And one of the issues where a lot of people get beaten up is in sort of central Maine, within a 100-mile radius of Augusta, say, where you've got people who are squatting on the land. They did not have title to it, and they resent rich people in Boston called landed proprietors who own this land and are selling it to them at pretty inflated prices. It sort of sounds like some of the housing issues that are going on these days. And there was a terrific scholar named Alan Taylor, still alive, who wrote a book called Liberty Men and Great Proprietors. And there were all sorts of riots and people getting killed and the militia getting called out, people sent to prison. It's really pretty ugly. And that's sort of inland. And then along the coast, there are a lot of smugglers who resent a lot of federal trade restrictions. And so they just decide to trade with the British and Canada anyways, especially with Nova Scotia and your neighbors in New Brunswick. Although I guess your neighbors are in Quebec, actually, when I think about it. So it's a pretty wild place. And the newspapers are doing this. There is vote fixing. The selectmen are sort of picking who can vote and who cannot. And there is, here's a word also in use in 2025, there's gerrymandering. And this is because of a governor of Massachusetts, Governor Gary, and because Maine is still part of Massachusetts, guess what? Gerrymandering is also a Maine thing. And it's, this redistricting to favor one party over another. Um, and again, this is the sort of thing we're hearing about now. It makes people quite ugly, right? Not happy about it. The big political figure who emerges from this is a gentleman named William King from Bath, and he's a ship owner. He's the richest man in the District of Maine. Um, he put his finger up in the political wind and decided that the squatters and the Jeffersonians were going to win. And so he threw in with them and became known as the friend to these squatters, and he used their votes to great advantage. And he was able to get a lot of political support uh, from dissenting religious groups. These would be Roman Catholics and the evangelicals who didn't like the Congregationalists. And he turns this to advantage, and he's known to be very ambitious. Everybody knows he wants Maine to become a state, and of course, the people in Boston absolutely hate him, although he's an elected representative who is serving there in Beacon Hill in Boston. So Maine kind of looks like this, and I'm talking about the part that is English speaking, what I would describe as Yankees. And this map sort of gives you a sense of who's voting where. The Jeffersonians are in red, the Federalists are in blue. So Federalists tend to dominate in Portland and other larger communities, usually in the county seats as well, whereas the more rural areas tend to be Jeffersonian. And it's close. It really surprises everybody when in the election of 1812 for governor, which is in April back then, that the Jeffersonians lose, including in Maine, and the Federalists come to power. And that's important because they really oppose this coming war of 1812, and they're going to pull all sorts of hijinks to interfere with them. So what happens is in June of 1812, President Madison is tired of Britain's harassment of American sailors and American shipping. He asks Congress to declare war. Congress duly does that with very little preparation, zero preparation for the Navy in a war against the world's largest Navy, very little preparation for the Army, some. And there are a lot of protests against it. Especially in that English-speaking part of Maine. Northern Maine, very interesting response. Essentially, they don't really hear about it. The big news for Northern Maine in the summer of 1812 is that the Bishop of Quebec is coming, and he does a little tour. And that's what people write about and get excited about. The war is a very distant thing for them, I think. Although British forces will be moving through, especially over by Madawaska. Let's see. So, Maine borders Quebec, but more pertinent in this period is New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has a big Navy base. So, Maine is very exposed, and people are worried. They're sending petitions, and even the tiniest of communities, like Robbinston in Washington County, it's amazing. They have no problem as fully egalitarian people of gathering together as a town and writing a letter directly to James Madison. They're happy to do it. They have no. Which I think is great. I mean, that's a democratic society, right? They should be able to do that, and why should they feel strange about that? And there are people writing for the war, against the war, people who want troops to protect their coastal community from the British, and big county-wide meetings and a lot of agitation. I don't think war is ever a happy experience. It shouldn't be. And there is a lot of misery caused by this war. There are there are protests. Back then, they tended to call it street theater, where they might have somebody dressed up as a famous general, or maybe put the town drunk in a fancy uniform, pretend to be a big general. There are riots where people are resisting recruiters. There is starvation in many communities because it's hard to grow food in a lot of Maine, and they really depended on food coming from the rest of the country to get them through that long, long winter. So there are people actually starving to death in Maine. Taxation goes through the roof. It increases by something like 300%, 3 times what you'd been paying before the war. And Maine is pretty hard scrabble. That's a devastating blow. There's disease, probably promoted by the movement of large bodies of men through the district. There's the threat of military force, that is to say, from our own government. The federal government is concerned that Massachusetts, including Maine, is going to resist the war and use the militia to fight the rest of the nation. So this also has, I think, reflections of 2025 where people are worried about the use of, the National Guard or the use of regular military forces to put down disorder. And this rattles people. Then as now, people don't like having troops in the streets bullying people. And this is on both sides, by the way. This is not a one-sided thing. So, and then, of course, there's this threat of invasion. Everybody on the coast feels very exposed to the Royal Navy, which is raiding communities, burning shipping, doing all sorts of terrible things. So it's bad. It's really bad. Now, in Madawaska, there are things happening. There are reports of espionage. There are British letters recording that an American is interfering with couriers who run between New Brunswick and Quebec, and or that Native Americans are doing this on the behalf of the Americans. And this is the Madawaska area, especially very important for the British, because they start moving forces from New Brunswick to the Great Lakes via Madawaska. And this starts with the New Brunswick Regiment, the 104th Regiment, which famously marches all the way to, Lake Ontario. And I think with almost no casualties, a winter march, by the way. And then also the Royal Navy will march sailors from St. John, New Brunswick through Madawaska on their way to the Great Lakes. So it's a pretty important place. And the British are concerned about American spies. They aren't sure where the border is. There are accounts by Royal Navy officers who are like, well, you're going to have to help me with the name of the lake above Madawaska. Temiscuda? I'm sure somebody will tell me. What's that?
Temiswater.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so this map pictured here, it's too small to see, but what the British did is they settled veterans, British soldiers. They gave them food and farming implements and allowed their families to go up there. And by ones and twos, they were settling them above Madawaska in order to sort of keep a lid on things. The British don't necessarily trust French speakers necessarily, although the French in the area remain loyal as far as I can tell. So there are some things going on, not so far away from you. And then things get much worse in 1814 because the British do invade. And they invade two places. They seize Eastport in July of 1814. And then in September 1st of 1814, the Penobscot expedition seizes Castine. There is the one big battle in Maine of the entire war called the Battle of Hamden, just below Bangor, where there's an American naval vessel there, the Corvette Adams, it's called. There are American militia there. There's a handful of regular U.S. Army there. And this scratch force sort of pulled together in the pouring rain, and they're supposed to defend the area against this British force of veterans who just come from Europe, who'd been fighting and had lots of experience. And you've got this force of basically farmers and sailors and others, and they just get run over. I think the battle lasts maybe 20 minutes, and the Americans run away pretty fast. Morale was pretty bad. Munition wasn't good. It was raining. Just a disaster. So what happens is that the British occupy the eastern third of Maine until the end of the war. They seize Machias. They already held Eastport on Moose Island. And there isn't a whole lot that the United States can do about it. The nation was broke. There was no money. The American Army was engaged in operations from New Orleans all the way up to the Great Lakes, and there were just no troops for Maine. And then the really disgusting thing is that Massachusetts does nothing to help out Maine either. The governor in Boston, in fact, hates the war. He's a Federalist. He doesn't want anything to do with the war. And in the winter of 1814, he actually sends an emissary to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he begins negotiating with them, saying, look, if, say, New England, and especially Massachusetts, were to secede from the United States and become their own country, would you help us out with arms? And these communications are done by couriers that go through Castine, Maine, which becomes a British base. And there's a local lawyer, almost certainly a lawyer from Blue Hill, who goes to Halifax and makes these really treasonous deals with the British, and all hush hush, right? You can't have anybody know. And in the meantime, the governor of Massachusetts is negotiating with the other states in New England to break away from the United States in the famous Hartford Convention, which was held in Hartford, Connecticut. So this again is grim, and it sets neighbor against neighbor. And the situation in the occupied zone is pretty awful. Here's a map of Castine, drawn by the British military. They heavily fortify it. The populace of Eastern Maine is disarmed, and this is an interesting thing. You can understand why the British take away everybody's guns, right? It's an occupied area, no surprise. But the wealthy people in places like Blue Hill and Castine say, no, we need our guns. And the British are like, okay, I bite. Why do you need your guns? And the response of the wealthy is really remarkable. It's because we're afraid of the poor people. If we don't have guns, they're going to burn our homes, essentially, is the thought. And this is all recorded by this lawyer from Blue Hill. There are spies moving around. There are some British spies. There are certainly American spies getting into Castine. And that's because Castine becomes this major base for smuggling, that the British open up Castine as a smuggling port, and Americans really want to buy a lot of British stuff, and they will bring food, cattle on the hoof or barrels of flour or whatever to pay for it, and the British really need that too. And it's a huge trade, and there's a lot of gunplay on Penobscot Bay over this, or even up in Bangor or Hamden or Bucksport, people shooting at each other, federal agents trying to capture smugglers resisting, or sometimes trying to capture back contraband that the federal government had seized. There's this issue of Massachusetts treason and what's going to happen there. And maybe the most troubling is that Massachusetts officials will collaborate with the occupying British military. And this is especially apparent in the sheriffs of Hancock and Washington counties who bend over backwards to help the British. And there are reasons for this. Law officers tend to prize order over liberty. And that's not just in Maine. That's also true, say, in occupied France in World War II. You know, the police are trying to keep a lid on things. That's kind of their job, right? So, unfortunately, in these cases, that means they are collaborating with the enemy, and both these sheriffs are going to have a rough time after the war because of this. Okay. And where does this misery lead? But to, well, happily, peace breaks out. But even peace isn't especially happy. What happens is on December 24th of 1814, a peace is signed by both British and American officials in Ghent in Belgium. And so the war is over. It takes a while for the news to get through. I think you all know that the Battle of New Orleans actually happens after the peace had broken out. But even the peace is not very happy. For example, there's a big British prison in Devon in England, which has thousands and thousands of American POWs, almost all of them sailors. And after the peace is signed out, the sailors, the prisoners get restless. The guards panic. They start firing into the American prisoners. They bayonet a bunch. They kill several, including at least one guy from Maine. So that's an unhappy incident. And those POWs extremely bitter about that for the rest of their lives. Eastport will remain occupied until 1818, when the British are finally persuaded that they shouldn't be there. The economy is bad. Taxes are high because we're still paying for the war. The summers are very, very cold that people's crops fail, and that means more starvation. The political division continues. But I think because of the treasonous conduct of Massachusetts, that Massachusetts ideal collapses. That the Congregational Church, not held in high regard because it had opposed the war, and many of the biggest opponents of the war had been Congregationalists, that this idea of Boston being a superior society and Maine should be run along the lines of Massachusetts is really hard to push when Massachusetts had behaved so treasonably during the War of 1812. And so Mainers get more organized, especially under William King, and he has politically prominent brothers who help him as well, including a brother who's a senator from where? Well, actually, his brother is a senator from New York, actually lived not too far from where I am now. And Maine gets the Massachusetts legislature to agree to let Maine become an independent state, but Congress would have to approve it. And then something unanticipated pops up, and that is, well, Missouri wants to be a state too. But Missouri has slaves. Massachusetts and Maine did not. And that becomes a big issue. And it looks like Maine may not become a state because of the slavery issue. And it's a little disappointing that some of Maine's founders, not William King, but others, were quite willing to see slavery spread if it meant that Maine could become a state, because they wanted Maine to become a state because they were going to become important government officials, right? So they sort of sold out in that regard. However, a compromise is made, the famous Missouri Compromise of 1820, and on, I want to say March 15th, is that Maine Day, March 15th, when Maine celebrates its statehood. So I think what I've been able to establish here is that, boy, Maine emerges from misery. But oddly enough, even though it wants to be separate from Massachusetts, when we get around to building a state house in Augusta, that state house is a miniature copy of the Massachusetts State House on Beacon Hill in Boston. So I'm not really sure. It's a partial breakaway. Mainers still look to Boston for leadership, for the social cues, for their baseball team, for you name it. And it's a big, wealthy place. And Maine is, sort of lightly populated and not very. So I don't know what that says about the state of Maine that I love. Although, confession here, I was born in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So don't hate me, please. All right. I think that is what I had to say. I do want to extend to you an invitation to come down to Long Island and please come to the American Merchant Marine Museum, which I direct. I guarantee you'll love it. It's a beautiful place and very easy to get to from Manhattan. Otherwise, I threw a lot at you quite quickly, and I hope it wasn't too disturbing. I don't really have politics. I don't belong to a political party or anything, but I can't help but notice parallels between then and now. And I'm not sure if that's comforting or if it's disturbing. But I guess I come down on the side of comforting in that we've been through this nonsense before. We've been able to overcome it. And in fact, when all this anger and hatred against New England and Massachusetts and bitterness about the war goes away because a new president is elected from Virginia, a guy named James Monroe. And he's the first president to visit the state of Maine, and while he's president. And people just love him. The Federalists love him. The Republicans, and he's a Republican, love him. And he's a person who has that touch to make people feel comfortable and good about themselves. And so we go from the War of 1812 and all this acrimony to what's called the era of good feelings, which is full of love and happiness. So I'm looking for a 21st century era of good feelings. I mean, let's hope that's the case, right? Because I'm really getting sick of the news. Hey, do you have questions for me?
I have just one question. It's more historical than anything, but you mentioned meeting houses, and that's an unfamiliar place or thing for us. We have seen, however, the existence of granges, and I'm wondering, is there a correlation between the existence of a grange during that time, and the
there isn't. So you didn't have meeting houses up in Aroostook County because when the Yankees came north, it was meeting houses had been abolished because Maine firmly separates church and state right from the beginning. And William King is successful in that. And in fact, might be the Maine Constitution is like, yeah, hey, we don't care if you're a Hindu or a Muslim. It's all good. So what that means is in southern Maine, you start seeing the meeting houses getting abandoned, and some of them are preserved, but they're just sort of empty buildings. They're beautiful buildings, but and you get specific church buildings being made, and so there is a change, an architectural change, quite literally, in how people see church and state. See, I'm a Yankee myself, so it's easy for me to talk about that. Much harder to talk about the Quebecois, French influences, Acadian influences in northern Maine, but it's interesting to me. So on my native Cape Cod, the houses had a slight bow to them, whereas houses in Madawaska went the other way. And Yankees had their bread ovens inside the house, and the French speakers had them outside the house. It's interesting that they're dealing with essentially the same climate, but come up with separate, different solutions for the same problems. So, humans are fascinating critters. We're messy, we're complicated, we do all sorts of weird things. Anybody else have any questions? Well, you're a very well-behaved crowd.
I have a comment, Joshua.
Sure.
It seems to me from your presentation that a lot of the conflict was born out of the desire to maintain autonomous identity in the various regions of the Massachusetts and Maine. They the way things that we're doing, that was fine with them, and somebody comes in and tries to threaten that, it becomes a source of conflict over and over and over again. So it's not surprising they couldn't get along very well during that time.
Yeah, no, it's true. And Massachusetts is trying to impose an idea of how society works. And I'm guessing, and the crowd I'm looking at, you pretty much all consider yourself peers. You're all equals, right? You're egalitarians. And these people from away are coming in. Maybe they have more money, or maybe that they're enormously wealthy people who bought up huge tracts of land, and they give themselves airs. They think they're better than the Mainers, and they are quite vicious in putting down people from Maine as rustics, unlearned, impoverished, uncouth, whatever you want to say. And would you believe Mainers resent that? Well, of course they do. Nobody wants to be called those things. And furthermore, and this might speak to 2025 as well, these people from away come in with these ideas of how to run society, and it's enormously expensive. It takes a lot of tax money to support the Congregational Church, the meeting house, the militia, the schools, the courthouses, the justice of the peace, on and on and on. And so Massachusetts is much more interested in having an active government that gets involved in people's lives. And the Maine population, much more content to be left alone, doesn't want big government, just wants to till their fields and cut their trees and not pay a lot of taxes, because it's hard to get cash to pay taxes in Maine. And so for me, it's far easier to sympathize with the people in Maine who just want to be left alone. I can't imagine how many times I've said to myself, gosh, I can't wait to get out of New York, where some people stop telling me what to do all the time. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, it's interesting you should bring that up, Joshua, because I grew up in potato country, northern Aroostook, and I remember bitter conversations in the potato storage facilities when the English would come in and try to tell the farmers how to do their work, when they thought they were perfectly capable of doing their work. And what are these people coming in here trying to tell us what to do anyway?
Yeah.
They were called and they were not very popular people.
Well, and I think that the old Yankees were quite culturally aggressive. They did want to impose ways of doing things on other people, and they had their own morality and their own ideas of what's wrong and what's right. And oh boy, and so much prejudice against Catholics as well. I mean, it's really, really appalling how much prejudice there was. And, people were getting beaten up. and a lot of bad stuff. So that doesn't surprise me that endured into the 20th century. I would hope in the 21st that stuff is largely in the past. I mean, I'm amazed at when I teach my midshipmen, most of them can't tell you the difference between a Protestant and a Catholic. They're vaguely aware they're both Christian groups. That's about it. Even if they are Christian, Catholic or Protestant, nobody ever sat them down and said, well, this is consubstantiation versus transubstantiation or whatever. So it's certainly a very different society as we change and become more diverse.
I frequently heard people call Episcopalians backdoor Catholics.
Well, those are some deep waters there. Not many Episcopalians around back in the 1812 period. There were a couple around Gardner, but that's it, because they were sort of associated with the English, so they weren't popular with Massachusetts people either. Oddly enough. I could tell you all sorts of stories, but I'll tell you one. I was in Ottawa. I was living in Ottawa when I was researching this book for a year on a Fulbright fellowship, actually. And I went to a big Methodist church right across from the Parliament building in Ottawa. And Ottawa's a big city, right? It's a nice town and a big city church. I forgot it was the last weekend. It was a Presbyterian church. My apologies. It was the last Sunday in October, which is for Presbyterians something called Reformation Sunday, where the minister was just blasting Catholics from the pulpit and saying, "Thank God we're not Catholics. We're so much better." I was horrified. I haven't been to a Presbyterian service since. I'm a very bad Methodist, but I don't understand the prejudice. Why can't we just leave each other alone, I guess? And anybody else have a question? Well, it's pretty deep waters. I guess I'll only consider this successful if I hear people were talking about this over coffee tomorrow morning. So. But I did enjoy it. I love talking to Maine audiences and get to really dig into the weeds of what Maine is and why it's a little different from the rest of the country. And to my shame, I haven't been to Fort Kent yet. One of these days. I don't think I've gotten above Holton. And I hate to think how many hours are you from your county seat?
Two.
Just 2? Okay. That's a long way on a map. I'm like, wow. So, anyways. Well, I guess that's it for tonight. You were all delightful. I hope you enjoyed it. And if there's anything I can do for you, or if you visit New York and want to come to my museum, just let me know, and Don can set you up with my contact information.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. And Don, am I good to go now?
You are fine. You're excused.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You folks, you're entirely welcome. And you folks take care. You're a lovely audience. Bye now.
Thank you.